Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. Before we begin, I want you to consider something that should trouble us all. What happens when the fate of an entire nation becomes nothing more than a bargaining chip between two superpowers? What happens when the people who suffer most have the least say in their own future? Tonight, we're going to examine one of the most consequential geopolitical shifts of our time, a shift that has left Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky standing alone on the world stage while the architecture of power is quietly redrawn around him. Let me be direct with you. The narrative we've been fed about Ukraine, about this conflict, about Western solidarity, it's collapsing before our eyes. And what's emerging in its place is something far more familiar to students of history and economics: the cold, calculated redistribution of spheres of influence between major powers, with smaller nations caught helplessly in between. This isn't new. This is the oldest story in the Imperial playbook. But this time, the players are Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Now I know what some of you are thinking. Professor Wolff, isn't this just speculation? Aren't you reading too much into diplomatic maneuvering? But here's the thing, we don't need to speculate when the patterns are this clear, when the historical precedents are this abundant, and when the material interests align this perfectly. Let me walk you through what's actually happening here. Think about what we witnessed during Trump's previous presidency. The man had an almost inexplicable deference to Putin, a reluctance to criticize Russia that stood in stark contrast to his treatment of traditional American allies. He withheld military aid to Ukraine. Remember that? That wasn't a bug in the system, that was a feature. That was a preview of the transactional world, you that now governs American foreign policy under his influence. Trump doesn't see Ukraine as a democratic nation fighting for survival. He sees it as a deal waiting to be made, a problem to be solved through negotiation between the big boys, and Zelensky simply isn't one of the big boys. Putin, meanwhile, has been playing a much longer game. He's watched NATO expansion with growing alarm for decades. He's seen the post-Soviet space shrink around Russia, and he's determined to reverse that trend. Ukraine isn't just another country to Putin. It's the historical, cultural, and strategic heartland that Russia believes it cannot survive without controlling. And here's the critical point. Putin knows that he doesn't need to convince the Ukrainian people. He doesn't need to win hearts and minds. He just needs to outlast Western attention spans and cut a deal with someone who shares his transactional view of the world. Enter the backdoor bargain. Now, we may not have the full details. These things are rarely conducted in the full light of day, but the contours are becoming unmistakable. Trump returns to power with a promise to end the Ukraine war quickly. How does one end such a war quickly? Not through Ukrainian victory, that's for sure. Not through genuine negotiation that respects Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. No, you end it quickly by giving Putin much of what he wants, by carving up Ukraine's future without meaningful Ukrainian input, by presenting Zelensky with a fait accompli: accept this settlement or lose American support entirely. This is where Zelensky's isolation becomes so profound and so tragic. The European allies, let's be honest, they've never had the stomach for a prolonged confrontation with Russia without American backing. They'll make the right noises, they'll express concern, they'll issue statements about sovereignty and international law, but when Washington pivots, Brussels follows. Zelensky knows this. He's watching the military aid slow to a trickle. He's watching the Western media attention drift to other stories. He's watching his erstwhile supporters quietly prepare for a post-American world order where accommodating Putin becomes the path of least resistance. And here's what makes this so insidious from an economic perspective, and you know this is where my analysis always goes. This isn't really about democracy versus authoritarianism, despite the rhetoric. This is about market access, about natural resources, about who controls the agricultural breadbasket of Europe, about pipeline routes and grain exports. Ukraine is one of the most resource-rich nations in Europe. It has vast agricultural capacity, significant mineral deposits, and strategic positioning that makes it invaluable for trade routes. The great powers aren't fighting over Ukrainian freedom. They're positioning themselves to control Ukrainian wealth. Trump understands this in his own crude, mercantilist way. He sees Ukraine as a drain on American resources with insufficient return on investment. Putin understands this in a more strategic, civilizational way, viewing Ukraine as essential to Russian great power status and economic viability. What neither of them particularly cares about is what the Ukrainian people actually want, how they've died by the hundreds of thousands defending their homeland, how they've built a national identity separate from Russia's shadow. That's all just noise in the great power calculation. So what does this backdoor bargain likely entail? Based on the historical patterns and the incentives at play, we can make some educated predictions. Ukraine probably cedes the Donbas region formally, legitimizing Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea and the subsequent territorial gains. Ukraine commits to permanent neutrality, no NATO membership, perhaps even restrictions on EU integration. Russia gets sanctions relief, phased and conditional, but ultimately allowing the Russian economy to reintegrate with global markets. And Ukraine gets to survive as a rump state, diminished, traumatized, and dependent on whatever scraps of Western aid continue to flow. Zelensky's tragedy is that he may have no choice but to accept this. He's fighting a war he cannot win without sustained Western support, and that support is evaporating. He can be principled and watch his country bled dry, or he can be pragmatic and accept a settlement that betrays everything Ukraine has fought for. It's Sophie's choice on a national scale. Now, some will call this realism. They'll say this is just how the world works, that idealism is a luxury Ukraine cannot afford, that a bad peace is better than endless war. And there's a seductive logic to that argument, but let's be clear about what we're really endorsing when we embrace this realism. We're saying that might makes right, that international law is meaningful only when great powers choose to respect it, that small nations exist at the sufferance of large ones, that the sacrifices of the Ukrainian people, their democratic aspirations, their extraordinary resistance, all of it counts for nothing against the cold equations of power politics. This should trouble us not just because of what it means for Ukraine, though that alone should be enough. It should trouble us because of what it reveals about the international order we've built and the values we claim to uphold. If Ukraine can be sacrificed on the altar of great power accommodation, what message does that send to Taiwan, to the Baltic states, to any small nation that depends on international guarantees for its security? The answer is clear: you're on your own. The rules-based order, it turns out, has always been more suggestion than law, more convenient fiction than actual framework. And here's where we need to connect this to the broader economic and political currents of our time. This isn't happening in isolation. This is part of a global retreat from multilateralism, from the idea that nations can cooperate based on shared rules and mutual respect. We're watching the return of spheres of influence, of transactional diplomacy, of naked power politics. And this shift is being driven by the same forces that have hollowed out the American middle class, that have created staggering inequality, that have subordinated democratic governance to the demands of capital, the logic of exploitation, of treating everything and everyone as resources to be extracted and traded. Trump and Putin, for all their differences, share a fundamentally similar world view. They see politics as zero, some competition, they value strength over cooperation, they have contempt for the institutions and norms that constrain raw power. They're both products of systems that concentrate wealth and authority, whether it's American oligarchic capitalism or Russian kleptocratic state capitalism. And in their world, Ukraine is not a nation of people with agency and rights. It's territory to be controlled, resources to be exploited, a problem to be managed. So where does this leave us? Where does it leave Ukraine? And perhaps more importantly, where does it leave the possibility of a world order based on justice rather than power? I won't lie to you, the answers aren't encouraging. Zelensky is increasingly isolated, his options narrowing with each passing day. The Ukrainian people face the prospect of a settlement imposed from above, negotiated by powers that don't share their interests. And the rest of us are left to watch as the veneer of principled internationalism is stripped away to reveal the brutal realpolitik underneath. But here's what I want you to understand, and this is crucial. None of this was inevitable. The choices being made are just that, choices. Trump chooses to prioritize his relationship with Putin over Ukrainian sovereignty. European leaders choose to defer to American leadership rather than charting their own course. The Western publics, ourselves included, we choose whether to pay attention or look away, whether to demand better from our leaders or accept their cynical bargains. History will judge this moment harshly, I believe. Future generations will look back and ask how we could have abandoned Ukraine after encouraging its resistance, how we could have sacrificed a democratic nation's future to accommodate an authoritarian aggressor. They'll see the parallels to Munich in 1938, to Hungary in 1956, to all the times when the great powers chose expedience over principle and convinced themselves they were being realistic. And the most bitter irony, this backdoor bargain won't even achieve its stated purpose. It won't bring lasting peace. It will embolden Putin to push further. It will signal to China that the West lacks resolve. It will destabilize the very international order that has, for all its flaws, prevented great power war. For nearly 8 decades, we're not choosing peace, we're choosing a different, more dangerous form of conflict, one where might make right and small nations live in permanent fear. Let me close with this. The Ukrainian people have shown extraordinary courage, extraordinary resilience, extraordinary commitment to the idea that nations have the right to determine their own futures. They've paid for that commitment in blood, in destroyed cities, in millions displaced from their homes. They deserve better than to be traded away in a backroom deal between Trump and Putin. They deserve a world that actually honors the principles it claims to uphold. Whether they get that world depends on us, on whether we're willing to demand it from our leaders, to reject the false realism that treats people as pawns. It depends on whether we can build movements strong enough to challenge the logic of power politics and economic exploitation that produces these obscene bargains in the first place. Zelensky may be isolated, but the Ukrainian people don't have to be. The cause of national sovereignty and democratic self-determination doesn't have to be abandoned, but it will require something from us. Attention, outrage, organization, and the courage to insist that another world is possible, even when the powers that be tell us to be realistic and accept the world as it is. Thank you for your time. I hope you'll think deeply about what's at stake here, not just for Ukraine, but for all of us who believe the world can and should be better than the brutal calculus of great power politics. The future is not yet written, but it's being written now, in the choices we make and the principles we're willing to defend. Let's choose wisely.